Thank you for joining us for this presentation. What I'm going to do in this presentation is provide you with an overview of the Unified Communications APIs that you use to interact with Link. My name is Oscar Newkirk, and I'm a consultant with my own firm, Oscarnew Consulting LLC. What I'm going to do in this presentation is to try and give you a brief overview of the various Link components and show you how those components are used by applications. Once you understand the basic components, then I'll show you where the Unified Communications APIs plug into those components and allow your applications to interact with Link. I'm going to spend some time describing endpoints, which are the main way that applications interact with Link itself, and tell you which Unified Communications SDKs create or use endpoints to do what they do. We'll then spend some time on doing a brief introduction to the Link APIs themselves, the Link 2010 SDK, which is on the client side, Unified Communications Managed API 3, which is where you build middle-tier applications, the Link Server SDK, which actually installs application code on the Link server itself, and then we'll talk about the Link Server 2010 Group Chat SDK, which you use to build applications that interact with the group chat components of Link. This slide provides an overview of the various components of Link and illustrates some of the data flows between those components. This particular diagram is a subset of the diagrams that were released by Microsoft that show you the various Link components and workflows. This particular one is simply the IAM and presence workflow. So this looks fairly intimidating, but in reality, when you're developing applications for Link or for integration with Link, you don't really need to worry about a lot of these components. And so what I'm going to do is kind of focus down on that set of components that do make sense for application developers that they do need to interact with and use when they're building applications. So let's focus down this diagram a little bit on just the components that are important for application development. In this case, what we're really going to look at are the front-end servers running in the enterprise pool, the Link client running on the user's desktop, and then various application servers that you can deploy in your environment to support hosting the applications you developed either with the UCMA SDK or the Group Chat SDK. The Link Client SDK installs on the user's desktop and actually runs against the running instance of the client for that user. All of the operations you do with the Link SDK essentially work through that connection to the running client on the user desktop. UCMA SDK applications are hosted on application servers in the middle tier. They essentially make secure connections to various front-end servers in the pool and allow you to build applications that run in the middle tier and do large-scale operations. The Group Chat SDK is a special purpose implementation on top of the UCMA SDK, and its purpose is to allow you to build applications that interact with the group chat components of Microsoft Link. And finally, the Server SDK allows you to build applications that run in the context of the front-end servers themselves and are able to monitor and potentially modify SIP traffic flowing through those servers. So now that we understand where the various Link SDKs plug into the Link components, let's talk a bit about endpoints. Endpoints are entities that register with the Link server and basically allows those applications to communicate with Link. So various of the Unified Communications SDKs create or use endpoints in order to provide that interaction with the server itself. So almost all of the Unified Communications APIs create or use endpoints when they interact with the Link server. The only exception to that is that the Link server APIs don't allow you to create endpoints, and that imposes some limitations on what you can do with those applications that we'll talk about when we get to the section talking about that API. An endpoint is used to identify and authenticate a connection to the Link server. So basically, any endpoint that wants to talk to Link server either has to authenticate or has to have a configuration on the server that says don't require authentication from that endpoint. Link defines basically two classes of endpoints that interact with it. User endpoints, which are associated with user accounts in the Active Directory, and application endpoints that are defined by a trusted application definition in AD and also configured in the Link configuration store by the administrator. All operations against the Link server have to be done with an endpoint that registered and authenticated with the Link server. So now that you've got an endpoint registered with Link using one of the SDKs, what can you do with that? So an endpoint that's registered with the Link server can publish presence information for the user or application that owns that endpoint. It can also request presence information about other user endpoints. So if I write an application using the UCMA Core SDK, create an endpoint with that API, such as an application endpoint or even a user endpoint, it can then say, what's Oscar Newkirk's presence, and get a response back from the server. It can also publish its own presence information to indicate its present state to other applications or other endpoints or other clients. It can also initiate SIP and media sessions with other endpoints. So my Unified Communications Managed API application endpoint can say, I'd like to start an IM session with Oscar's endpoint, and send that through the server and establish that IM session, interchange messages, and whatever else you do over IM sessions. It can also respond to invitations from other endpoints. So if the application endpoint is sitting there running on my middle-tier server and a Link client says, I'd like to start a session with that endpoint, that invitation comes into the application endpoint and can be accepted or rejected or whatever needs to take place for the scenario that you're addressing. There are some differences in the capabilities of user endpoints and application endpoints. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those right now, but one of the key ones is that application endpoints can publish a special state of presence called always online. And essentially what that tells the Link server is that when any endpoint asks for the presence of an application endpoint, if that application endpoint has got this always online presence state, say, yep, it's online, and basically don't bother asking again because it's always going to be online. So it's a way of optimizing the presence query traffic related to application endpoints. There are also some differences in the capabilities of the Unified Communications APIs in dealing with presence in sessions. In particular, not all session types are supported by all of the APIs. So let's talk about endpoint use in the UC SDKs. The Link 2010 SDK, the client SDK, doesn't actually create an endpoint for itself. It uses the Link client running on the user's desktop. And that client has created a user endpoint when it logged into the Link server. All of the operations in the client SDK happen in the context of the capabilities of that user endpoint. And a lot of the operations in the client SDK don't actually involve interacting directly with the endpoint, but involve interacting with various UI elements or business logic elements in the client itself. This is positive in the sense that you can do a lot of things with it, but can be a limitation if you need a scenario that's not supported by that operation. The Unified Communications Managed API allows applications to create either user endpoints or application endpoints. And since they're creating the endpoints directly, they have a lot more control over the operation of the endpoints than that which is provided by the Link Client SDK. You have a lot more capability, but you have a lot more work to do to manage the capabilities and manage the interaction. The Link Server 2010 Group Chat SDK creates endpoints that interact with the group chat server and chat rooms. So basically special purpose endpoints that are oriented toward interacting with those components of Link. The Link Server 2010 SDK doesn't actually create endpoints. It doesn't create sessions, and it can't create SIP messages. It essentially creates applications that run on the Link front-end servers, and those servers see all the SIP traffic flowing through the Link front ends and are able to monitor and or modify that traffic. But they are not able to create traffic since they can't create endpoints. Now what I'm going to do is give you a brief introduction to the various Unified Communications APIs. I'm going to talk about the Link 2010 SDK, the UC Managed API SDK, the Link Server 2010 SDK, and the Group Chat SDK. The Link 2010 SDK consists of a couple of components: a set of managed code elements in the Microsoft.link model namespace, and a set of controls in the Microsoft.link.controls namespace. Both of these interact with the Link client running on the user desktop. The model components allow applications running on the desktop to interact with the client to do things like create sessions, be notified when sessions are created, get the content of various IM sessions that might be going on the desktop, and also potentially to inject data into those sessions. In addition, this is the API that supports contextual panels in link conversations, and you'll see more about that in some of the other presentations in this series. The controls allow you to take your Silverlight application or your WPF application and drag and drop those controls into the application to provide various parts of the link client experience embedded in your application's UI itself. So for example, if you drag in the presence control and your application renders that, you provided a SIP address that the control should be bound to, when your application runs, it displays the presence information for the person that you've bound to that SIP address, and gets that by querying the local desktop client to get that information. Both of those components, both the models and the controls, use that user endpoint encapsulated by the client. So the application that uses the Link Client SDK uses that endpoint created by the Link Client running on the desktop. The behavior of that endpoint is defined by the Link 2010 application logic. The good part about that is that it takes care of a lot of the details for you and lets you do rapid application deployment. You don't have to worry about the details of how to get a user endpoint to create a session, manage the IM flow, do all those sort of things, because the client's going to do that for you. The limitation is that you have to accept in your application the behavior that business logic, that application logic on the client provides. There is one way to change that a little bit in terms of running the client in what's called UI suppression mode, which basically turns off all of the client UI and makes your application totally responsible for the user interface portion for interacting with the clients. The Unified Communications Managed API SDK allows the developer to build applications with user endpoints or application endpoints. Each of those endpoints can participate in IM and audio sessions or publish in query presence. It's used primarily to create middle-tier applications that handle operations like call routing and query response operations. So for example, you can create an IM bot or an interactive voice bot that shows up on people's contact list as help desk. And when they initiate an IM session or initiate a voice call to that context, to that application, the middle tier application running on the server can interact with the user to say, please tell me what your problem is. Is it with email? Is it with whatever else? Do a bunch of IVR type operations and then dispatch that session to the appropriate help desk personnel based on the context that it got from the user. The UCMA Workflow SDK provides a set of the same sorts of operations that the UCMA API provides, but it encapsulates them in Windows workflow activities. The main benefit to this is it allows you to build these applications, such as IVR systems, using graphical workflow designer tools instead of actually having to write this code yourself. It can be a very easy and very productive way to build applications in the middle tier using UCMA type functionality. So the UCMA 3 SDK allows applications to create as many user or application endpoints as needed for its operation. You're not limited to creating one application endpoint or one user endpoint in a given application. You create as many as you need to interact with your facilities. It also has access to the facilities of the Microsoft Speech namespace to do speech recognition and text-to-speech operations for audio sessions. As I said, the workflow activities can be used to build UCMA applications using workflow designers and workflow runtime. You should note, however, that the UCMA API does not have built-in support for video, application, desktop sharing, or file transfer sessions. It does, however, expose the capability for you to define your own custom session types and to create those and support them in your applications. The Link Server 2010 SDK. The Server SDK is used to create applications that actually run on the front-end servers and in the context of the Link Server process itself. These applications are written in MSPL, or the Microsoft SIP processing language, and have access to all the SIP packets flowing through the server. You should know, however, that there are a set of existing applications already installed and running on the server that do various operations. And the way that the server operates is that each installed application is called in sequence in the installation order as SIP operations pass through the server. Any application you develop and install need to be installed in the sequence of the operations on the server and need to be installed in the appropriate position in that sequence in order to accomplish what they want. So for example, if you want your MSPL application to be able to see register requests from the clients, you need to install it in that sequence prior to the execution of the registrar function, which will basically take the SIP registration packets, process them, and then not pass them on further in the context, simply return data to the client. If you don't install your application before the registrar, you will never see SIP registrations because they're handled earlier in the sequence and responded to before it ever gets to your application. If your application can operate solely in the MSPL context, that's great. That's the better performance choice. Basically, that's the fastest, least impact on performance on the server. However, if there are things it needs to do that can't be done in the MSPL context, it is possible for your MSPL script to call out to a managed code DLL that can do more processing and has access to more things. So for example, if you wanted to do some sort of custom logging, your MSPL application could say, if I see this particular type of SIP packet or from this particular user, then call out to my managed code DLL, pass it the context of the SIP packet, and your managed code DLL could turn around and say, write it off to a database or whatever sort of operations you want to have it do for you. So you can do that, but if at all possible, you should really try and stay in the MSPL context, simply because, as I said, it is a much higher performance situation. One of the common things I see that people have problems with or have issues finding out about is that they say, I want to write a MSPL application, I want to write a link server application, but I want to be able to send messages or create messages with that. So this isn't really possible with the link server applications. Remember I said that the link server SDK doesn't actually create endpoints, so it can't originate traffic. It can simply look at the traffic flowing through the server and potentially modify or reroute those packets, but it can't originate a SIP packet in and of itself. So the last SDK that I'm going to talk a little bit about is the Link Server 2010 Group Chat SDK. This is a special purpose SDK built on top of UCMA that provides the ability to interact with the group chat server components of Link. So it provides you with the ability to write applications that connect to chat rooms, browse the content or history of chat rooms, and also send and receive messages to the rooms. You can also use it to build custom management applications to manage the chat rooms and the user access to those rooms. Finally, I'd like to show you some resources that you can go look at to get further information about the topics we've been talking about. In particular, if you look at the Link how-to videos on Channel 9, they provide an excellent example and introduction to various operations using the Link APIs. Thank you very much, and I hope you got something out of the presentation.